When the shouting fades and the iron taste leaves the air, there is a quieter kind of terror. It comes after the shield wall buckles, after the boats push off with smoke at their backs, after men lie still and the ravens choose. It comes for those still breathing, the wives who wait behind doors that never open, the daughters who carry water to a home that no longer exists, the widows who begin to understand that the dead have the easier work. The chronicles say little, ink stiffens around battles and kings, but sometimes, just sometimes, the truth leaks through. In the spring of 821, an Irish annalist noted that sea raiders struck at Íthner, the headland we now call Howth, and carried off a great prey of women. A single spare line, a cargo of human lives. Imagine one of those women, call her Íthner, standing by the tide's edge as oars bite water. The shoreline recedes into a strip of green, then nothing. Around her, the ship's crew move with practiced calm. Ropes coiled, sails reefed, the same efficiency they give to netting a catch. She notices wrists burn where the rawhide chafes, notices the exact number of planks between herself and the men with axes, notices that no one meets her eyes for long. She tries to fix the sky in her memory. The men call out in a language that comes at her like weather, hard consonants, sibilants. But a tone emerges in any tongue. Reckoning. The ship veers south, then east into a river mouth thick with brackish smell. She doesn't know the name of this place. Later ages will call it Dublin. Long before Dublin grew stone skin and smoke, it was mud and timber, posts driven into the riverbed to bite against current. Archaeologists mapped those posts, layer after layer along Wood Quay, and traced how the waterfront was rebuilt and extended across the 9th and 10th centuries, a living edge pushed outward for mooring and markets. Among the most lucrative goods moving across those slippery planks were people. The National Museum of Ireland puts it plainly. Monasteries and settlements were targeted not only for chalices and reliquaries, but for captives who could be sold. In early medieval Dublin, slaving wasn't a footnote to trade, it underwrote it. Íthner is marched past sheds that smell of tar and stale beer. She registers details the way the body stores pain, a beam scarred at man-height from years of shackles rubbing, a gutter cut through a packed floor to drain what no one speaks of, the way sunlight gathers in the doorway and then is gone. 2 women are priced aloud. A third is redirected to a different buyer because she limps. Transactions settle with weighed silver, notched and clipped and smoothed by 1,000 palms. We like to imagine cruelty as a storm, sudden, wild, disordered, but here it proceeds by arithmetic, by habit, by the weight of daily markets. Scholars stress how difficult it is to see slaving directly in the dirt. People are tragically better at hiding the evidence of other people as goods, but the combined record of texts and ports like Dublin makes the structure visible, a system that raided for labor, for concubines, for exchange on routes that ran both westward and eastward through the Baltic and the great rivers. There is a law that follows Íthner even when no one speaks it to her face. The Old Norse called the unfree a thrall, a thrall, and in the northern law codes that survive, Gulathing in Norway, Gragas in Iceland, slavery is not a metaphor, but a category with rules, fines, inheritances, the legal grammar by which a person becomes property. Medievalists reconstruct the picture from fragments, from the wording of offences where compensation is owed to an owner, from the way a freedman remains bound by obligations, from provisions that reveal a hard truth echoed across Europe, that the status of a child could depend on the status of its mother. It is dry on the page, it is cold in practice. A child born to a captive mother might be a ledger entry before it ever breathes. And still, the sagas and sermons are quiet where we want them to shout. In that quiet, archaeologists read the ground. Along Dublin's riverfront, storage rows and jetties expand through the 9th century, the timbers dating like tree rings to years of growth. Ship traffic increases. The town learns to hold more. If the docks grow, so do the stakes for any woman delivered to them. Not all captives remain in Dublin. Some are sent inland to farmsteads as household labour and forced partners. Others travel outward, bundled into the long exchange that ties the Irish Sea to the Baltic and then to the Volga. The word Rus will turn up later in an Arab diplomat's account along the Middle Volga, where Scandinavian traders and warriors ply their river cities. His description of a chieftain's funeral will chill posterity. But long before that brazier is kindled, the same trade winds that carry silk and wine also carry women's names away. What follows for Íthner is not a single event, but a narrowing. On a farm, the seasons keep their indifferent march. Lambing, haying, slaughtering, the earth asking the same work of any hands that can do it. You can imagine small mercies, another captive who shares a language, the way snow takes the bark off sound and makes a morning endurable, a kindness smuggled in the kitchen by a freeman's wife who remembers being a daughter herself. You can imagine a winter evening, smoke pooling in rafters, when someone tells a story about a saint who crossed a sea on a millstone, and you recognize the saintess' name from a monastery you once visited with your husband. You can imagine instinctively glancing to the door, the calculation now embedded in your muscle. How far to run, how far to live. But laws, logistics, and custom make escape the rarest of outcomes. The brutality here is not only harm, it is enclosure. The men who took Íthner do not think of themselves as villains inside their own stories. They have words that dress what they've done in the cloth of normal life. Bride price, fosterage, taking spoils, settling debts. Early medieval law from Scandinavia grades penalties for harming a thrall in coin, not in blood. The economies of Dublin and York tally souls the way ports tally barrels. Yet even within the sources closest to power, another current surfaces. Clerics appalled by human sale inside Christian lands, charters that free captives for the good of a benefactor's soul, poetry that betrays in its swerves and silences the felt cost of this traffic. Systems excuse, people sometimes see. Centuries later, genetics adds a cold light to what the texts half say. Studies of modern Icelanders, a population seeded during the same centuries that fed Dublin docks, show a split ancestry. Most patrilines trace to Scandinavia, while a majority of matrilines trace to the British Isles. Scientists argue about the exact percentages and the mechanisms, but the shape of the finding is consistent across methods. Women from Ireland and Scotland, men from Norway. If you are careful with your inferences, you cannot help but hear the long echo of ships and markets in that asymmetry. Numbers do not weep. They will, however, preserve what the annalists did not bother to record. The sleep story pauses here because sleep does. There is a part of the night when memory loosens its fingers from the day, when even a captive can drift. In the dark, Íthner's mind returns to a shore and a husband with a thatch of hair that refused a comb, to the sound of cattle at dusk, to the laugh of a sister filling a pail too high. She has learned to hoard small images, what the law cannot count, what the market cannot price. Dawn will come with its chores and its mathematics. For now, there is the seashell she keeps tucked in the hem of her dress, scoured white by the Liffey, smooth enough to press into her palm until pain cancels other pain. If you listen to the ground beneath the North Atlantic world, if you walk the warehouses on Wood Quay in your mind, if you run your fingers along the damp timbers and feel where chains worried them smooth, you can still hear the market's metronome. But you can also hear the interruptions. A monk who buys a girl to free her, a farmer's wife who shields a child from a blow, a man who refuses to pass a body along for profit. These do not overturn a system. They are not triumphs. They are the human grit that kept the machine from turning perfectly. The machine, not the axe, is the true nightmare of this story. What the Vikings did to the wives of defeated warriors was often worse than death, because it was longer than death. It turned a life into a unit of time and labor and reproductive capacity. It sharpened grief into accountancy. It made tomorrow feel like a punishment for surviving today. And yet the very endurance of those tomorrows left traces history can still find. A line in an annal, a key rebuilt for the third time, a law that preserves its own indecency, a genome whispering of crossings no scribe described. Those traces let us tell Íthner's story without pretending we know every step she took. They are enough to know what was taken and what, against the odds, she kept. By the second morning, she learns the rhythm of the place. The river breathing with the tide, the creak of moorings, the shuffle of feet at daybreak when men count what the night didn't steal. A merchant with a nicked thumb inspects her wrists the way a cooper inspects a stave. She doesn't look at him, not out of pride. Pride is a luxury, but because not looking is safer. A boy brings bread. She breaks it carefully, the way her mother taught her to break first loaves of harvest, as if ritual could smuggle order back into a life that has been turned into inventory. Nearby, a woman bargains with a foreman for the chance to ransom a sister. The words are low, urgent, the kind that turns silver hot. The foreman shrugs in a language Íthner cannot follow, then tips his head toward the river as if to say, "The tide doesn't stop for love." She understands that gesture. The machine runs on time and hulls and hands. Markets like this are a choreography of distances. Men stand far enough to talk price without hearing breathing. Captives stand close enough to catch a word and make a guess at their own future. Ransom succeeds sometimes, the monk with a purse of borrowed coins, the kin group that empties a chest, but often it is only an hour's hope, then dispersal. Some captives are walked inland along the Liffey Valley to farms, where a thrall day is measured in chores and pregnancies and winters that taste of smoke. Others are put aboard ships whose prows have learned the mapped audacity of the Irish Sea. Farther still, there are roads without roads, portages stitched from habit, river corridors up the Dnieper and Volga, where northerners trade and tax and kneel before emperors at Constantinople, their oars stowed and their hair combed, as if good manners could launder a ledger. Not every captive travels that far. It is enough for terror that the routes exist. Knowledge of distance is its own kind of chain. If the men here were asked, few would call what they do monstrous. They would call it lawful, even pious, when coin funds a church roof. Law is their weather, Old Norse and Icelandic codes that in time scribes will assemble into books, dry as dust and clear as ice. A thrall is a category. A wound has a price. The life of a free woman counts differently from the life of a slave. Íthner will never read those pages, but she will feel them as surely as a draft under a door. The law's genius is to make brutality legible, and therefore ordinary. It tells a farmer how to count his dead, and how to inherit a body. It tells a harbour master who can be bought on a holy day. There are clauses for manumission too, light in the rafters where smoke pools, proof that not everyone made a virtue of possession. But the grammar bends always toward ownership. The story the competitor tells is sharpest when it rests here, on the scaffolding no retelling can wish away. Raids that ended in markets, women renamed and repriced, a web of routes that turned cold water into highways. Law like a cage you cannot see until you reach for its bars, where that script overreaches into runic invoices etched with prices like shop bills into breeding pens, catalogued by church ledgers, into mass graves of women at places where spades have in fact found mostly men. It weakens its own case by asking more of the earth than the earth will yield. So we hold the line. We keep what scholars can carry and add only what deepens without distorting. The cadence of keys, rebuilt again and again, the analyst's chill brevity, the witness on the Volga who, with an outsider's steady hand, wrote what he saw, and the genetics that hum in the background like a drum beat you don't notice until the song stops. What Vikings did to the wives of defeated warriors was worse than death because it was protracted and procedural. It took the sudden cruelty of battle and stretched it across years. It made grief a schedule. On a farm to the north, Íthner learns the names of seasons in another tongue. She is taught how this household counts, how much butter must be churned by the feast of a saint whose name she mispronounces, which calves are the Lord's and which are the overseer's perquisite. How many skeins must hang from the beam before a new cord for the loom will be cut? The first time she bleeds late and then not again. A calculation happens out loud around her and not to her. No one needs to say the law. The law is in their posture, the way a man's voice lowers when he speaks of the spring. In winter, when the river locks and the sky presses close, she remembers a day at home when her husband laughed with his whole face, when she thought there would be many such days, and she permits herself the smallest blasphemy, to believe that memory is a kind of ownership the market cannot price. Yet even here, inside a system blunt as an axe, people sometimes splinter away from what is expected of them. A freeman's wife hides a lock of hair in Íthner's palm the day labor pains begin, and says nothing because women understand that the world is remade in rooms with shut doors. A monk arrives with coins and walks away empty, then returns with more, then returns again with a letter naming a sin no transaction can absolve. And the steward looks at the floor afterward as if studying grain. A fisherman offers no sermon, only a seat by a hearth for a child with a cough. These are not victories, they do not unbuild keys, but they make the machine skip, and in the stutter some lives slip sideways and find a different tomorrow. Elsewhere the empire of habit fails with a shatter. Armies winter and their trash heaps tell ugly truths. What meat was eaten, what died of sickness, what was broken for sport. Camp bones are mostly male because campaigns eat men. That is what the spades found at places like Repton, where the calendar of 873-874 is sealed in soil. Women vanish from such sites, not because they were piled there, but because they were moved elsewhere, parceled out, taken off in the quiet, the way smoke leaves a room through a hole in the roof. Evidence by absence that the raid did not end when the last shout did. In towns upriver and across the sea, hordes of foreign silver whisper of exchange with worlds that also bought people. In another register altogether, centuries later, the DNA in living mouths tells the same direction of travel. Mothers from across the water, fathers from the north. That is not the whole story of love or force, but it is a compass that keeps pointing the same way. Sometimes resistance grows teeth. Chronicles name women who fled to convents rather than marriage by decree, and charters celebrate acts of freeing for the soul's sake, which, pious or calculating, still changed someone's day. There are stories too, harder at the edges, of captives who turn knowledge against their takers. The competitor's script names one such figure and then wraps her in the firelight of vengeance. We will not gild what we cannot cite, but we can say that knowing the routes of capture, the ways of camps and river guards and dawn watches, gave some women and their allies the rare leverage to break the pattern for a few, and to leave a rumor that stiffened others. Spines. Even rumor is a weapon when a system relies on dread. Night deepens around the farm where Íthner lives now. Frost plates the thatch. Beneath it, a baby stirs and sleeps again. She lies awake and counts a litany that has learned new names. Saints she never met, rivers she never saw, women she never spoke to, whose lives nonetheless jostle her own across time. The analyst in his cold cell writing the word. Women, as if writing the weather. The envoy on a far river shore watching a slave girl walk toward a fire. The unknown daughters whose mitochondria will braid into the line of a people that thinks of itself as island-born and sea-made. She's not comforted, But she is steadied, and sometimes steadiness is all a body needs to find a morning. We will end the night as we began it, with counting. Not the market's arithmetic, years of labour, children expected, bodies priced, but another kind altogether. She counts breaths like stepping stones across a dark stream. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. Each square an island, each island a refusal. Long after towns forget the names of their builders, long after quays rot and are rebuilt, long after coins blacken in the ground and are lifted again, this is what remains of the wives of defeated warriors, a stubborn human beat that says, I am here, I am here, I am here, until dawn takes over the counting and the day starts again. Spring returns like a slow bell, and with it the market day that draws the farm toward the river. Íthner is sent with others to carry skeins and butter into town, a test of trust, or simply a calculation that rope and tide still decide her path. The road smells of thawed peat and alder catkins. Men pass leading pack horses, boys run ahead with jokes they are almost old enough to understand, and somewhere a lark tries to stitch the cold sky back together. She walks in a quiet shaped by many months of measuring rooms. The city takes shape as a dark band, then a scatter of rooftops, then the blunt geometry of sheds and quays. The same pilings stand tar-slick and breathing with the tide, and for a moment she is two selves at once. The woman who arrived with wrists rubbed raw, and the woman who now knows which boards creak and which guards are less cruel than their voices suggest. Markets are lessons in grammar. Prices are a syntax. She hears it again, the clipped negotiations that pretend to be impersonal while sorting human futures with every shrug. There are no speeches here, only habit. Law lives beneath the words like a foundation. Not everyone who trades speaks it aloud, yet everyone behaves as if they feel its shape. She has learned the shape by touch. A thrall can be bought, can sometimes be freed. A child inherits a mother's status unless a master chooses a different arithmetic. There are saints' days when trade pauses for a few hours, then resumes without apology. There are men who tie piety to purchase as if holiness were a ribbon that makes cruelty presentable. There are clerics who hold out purses and later copy neat lines into charters that proclaim a freedom no one will enforce once the ink dries. There are stewards who tell themselves that the law is simply weather and that they are only walking through rain. The competitor's telling is sharp when it lingers on this machinery, the way a culture makes violation ordinary by giving it rules and receipts. We have kept that frame because accuracy is a kind of reverence for the dead and because the truth is heavy enough without adornment. The script reaches too far when it imagines inventories etched in runestone like shop tallies, or breeding pens filed in church ledgers, or a pit of only women at a place where spades read a different story. We leave those behind. What remains is enough. A port rebuilt again and again, an annal that names a prey of women, a winter camp dated to a single hard season, an envoy who wrote down what he saw by a foreign river, and the quiet ring of mothers, lineages in the genomes of islanders who think of themselves as sea-made. This is the 50 and the 100 and the 1,000 that turn the wheel. Íthner stands near a stall where a farmer's wife sells cheese with the pride of a maker. The woman's hands move with the competence of someone who has performed this ritual since girlhood. Íthner watches and feels a curve of memory, the way her own mother used to pinch the skin of curds to judge their firmness. A child at the stall cries at the crowd and is gathered to a hip, where breath steadies without a word. The simple choreography of comfort breaks her for a moment, and she looks down into her palm where she has hidden the liffey shell for so long. Its edge has dulled with the grease of kitchens and the rub of winter cloth, yet it still carries a faint salt that no river lost. She closes her fingers and feels the smooth oval, a private syllable she can speak without sound. The harbour has its own music. Caulking hammers knock, gulls write their rude punctuation across the air. Ropes creak in counterpoint, and beneath it, all the water keeps its patient metronome. Ships stand ready for the routes everybody knows and nobody names. North and west to the isles, inland to towns where tongues braid and laws switch at river bends, east along corridors that lead toward great cities and courts that buy with a generosity seated on the backs of others. The system is not a rumour, it is a calendar. There are seasons for raiding and seasons for market months when pastures feed and months when herds are culled and flesh is salted for winter. Winters when armies overwinter, and their rubbish tells archaeologists 1,000 years later exactly what meat they ate and what strangers lived among them. Women vanish from those camps not because they lie in the pits, but because they are not permitted to lie still anywhere for long. If what Vikings did to the wives of defeated warriors was worse than death, it is because it turned private grief into a public instrument. Death is a door. This was a corridor that never ended, a road boarded up at every turning by law and custom, a future laid out like ledger lines, where a life could be written as labor, fertility, obedience, value. Men who thought of themselves as honorable could stand inside such lines and call it order, and could sleep without dreams because the world said so. The harm did not need whipping posts and spectacles to be terrible. It needed mornings. It needed years. It needed the long sameness that makes a person forget the reach of their own voice and begin to talk softly even when they are alone. And yet the machine never ran as perfectly as its builders believed. Somewhere, a convent door opened and shut on a girl who chose a cell over a marriage that felt like a sentence. Somewhere a charter scratched a name into freedom and meant it, and a woman walked away in daylight, carrying a bundle and a new kind of fear. Somewhere a ruler taxed a trade he would not end, which made a ledger of something shameful, which later let scholars know exactly what had been done. Somewhere a farmwife decided that her God did not require her to harden, and she set a bowl of broth on a step where a child would have to trip over it in order not to eat. Resistance lives in acts too small for chronicles, and in rumors that strengthen the wrist of the next person who tries. Years turn until time itself becomes a kind of mercy, because habit is less cruel than surprise. Íthner's child learns to speak in a language that thickens her vowels, and to pray in a church that rings different bells than the ones his mother knew. She teaches him another word for water when they are alone, a softer word that tastes like river on the tongue, and he repeats it as if it were a game. He likes the shell and asks why she keeps a stone in her dress, and she tells him it is how you carry a shoreline when you cannot carry a shore. The words are simple, but he looks at her as if she has shown him a talisman. She cannot give him the name his father chose, cannot give him the roof under which she once slept, cannot give him the field where they cut hay and laughed. She can give him a breath, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4, and teach him that counting is not only for markets. It can be a rope thrown over a high branch when the river rises. The wider world shifts. Men who wore one kind of brooch now wear another, kings fade and banners change, yet ports keep counting and law keeps filing, and new names replace old ones on documents that still steeple human lives into categories. Systems do not vanish, they molt. The words indenture and bond and ward take their turns, as if language could absolve the ledger by changing the heading. Long after the ships that brought Íthner are tar and memory, a scholar will sort coins in a museum's light and find foreign silver in northern soil, and another will read timber rings from Dublin's waterfront and map expansions that needed more than wool and fish to justify themselves. And another will run statistical models on living mouths and see the skew from fathers to mothers that points to crossings no scribe cared to narrate. The past is not gracious, but it keeps better records than it intends. At night, Íthner sometimes dreams she is standing again on the quay at low tide, mud sucking at her sandals, and that the city has been lifted away, leaving only posts in a gridded forest, and the river moving like a beast through the ribs. In the dream, she is not afraid. She walks between the pilings and ties strings between them, a web that catches morning light. People begin to step through this lattice and discover they cannot take a straight path to the ships. Some turn back to their houses, some sit and wait for a new road, some untie the strings patiently and then discover there are more behind them. When she wakes, the dream does not console her. It does, however, leave her with a feeling that the world is slightly less inevitable than yesterday. What Vikings did to the wives of defeated warriors was a theft of tomorrows, a conversion of love and labor into units, a making of lives into long corridors without doors. The bones and beams and books that survive let us say so without shouting, which is the best way to carry hard truth into sleep. We keep 70% of what the old telling got right, the markets and the routes, and the law that made it all seem ordinary. We add the 30% that strengthens, rather than distorts, the whisper of dendrochronology along a quay, the measured voice of an envoy by a foreign fire, the steady arithmetic of a winter camp, the cold echo of mothers in a gene pool. And then we give the last word back to one woman. She presses a shell into a small hand and says a word for water that the market never priced. The boy repeats it until the sound belongs to him. Outside, the river goes on counting. Inside, two people keep a different ledger that no steward can read.